Horror stories often literalize the return of the repressed, and Afterlife with Archie, wherein zombie hordes rise in Riverdale to threaten the world, does the same. But in Afterlife, this return is both narrative and metatextual, evoking histories of comics censorship. The return of the repressed is a Freudian concept extending from Freud's theory of consciousness, wherein primitive drives, like sexuality, are repressed but preserved in the unconscious. But they don't always stay there. Sometimes what's repressed returns in new forms. Such returns can be uncanny, i.e., quote, something which is secretly familiar, which has undergone repression and returned from it, end quote. We often see this in horror, where the terror that monsters convey is inextricably linked to recognition of the monster as frighteningly familiar. The transformed teens in Afterlife are quite literally frighteningly familiar, but the repression they represent is more diffuse, partly because in Archie comics, in the idealized portrait of post-war American suburbia they represent, so very many things are repressed. In his book, 12-Cent Archie, comic scholar Bart Beatty describes Riverdale as a timeless, quote, bucolic suburban utopia in which social divisions, particularly those brought about by racial difference, do not exist, end quote. Moreover, though romance exists, sexuality does not. In Afterlife, the zombies herald the return of the repressed concepts of death and change. The apocalyptic conditions they create also inspire the return of repressed violence and sexuality, including, as discussed in another video, queer sexuality. But on a metatextual level, the intrusion of zombies into the world of Archie comics also signals the return of a repressed comics genre, horror, into a genre, teen humor, that historically contributed to and benefited from that repression. The anti-comics crusade of the 1950s, inflamed by Frederick Wertham's bestseller Seduction of the Innocent, landed hardest on crime and horror comics. Indeed, the language of the 1954 Comics Code was designed to help drive leading horror publisher EC Comics out of business. Archie publisher John Goldwater described himself as a prime architect of the Comics Code. Even if we accept that his motivations were primarily moral, Archie directly benefited from the post-code waning of other genres and publishers. By 1966, Archie held a huge market share. Interestingly, the covers of Afterlife with Archie evoke the style of the same EC horror comics Archie once helped drive out of business. It also resurrects Archie's then repressed history, reprinting excerpts from the company's 1972 horror anthology Chilling Adventures in Sorcery. To what degree this return of the repressed critiques or deconstructs Archie's historical participation in creative and social repression is subjective, but for attuned readers, part of the thrill of Afterlife with Archie is seeing Archie be transformed by what it tried to bury.